big question that plagues a lot of learners of Chinese, or really any academic subject for that matter, is how do I retain all this information that is trying to get into my brain in a relatively short period of time? We're all about learning Mandarin really quickly, but of course, if you're using techniques that put a lot of information into your head in, say, 1 hour or 2 hours, how are you going to remember all of it? Well, spaced repetition software, based on over 100 years of research, has solved this problem in the most efficient way possible. You still have to do some kind of reviewing, but what if you could do the least amount of reviewing possible while still retaining the information? Well, luckily, that's what spaced repetition software does, or SRS, which is how we'll be referring to it from now on. Now, SRS has two sides of it. There's the memory game, and then there's also the frequency game. Now, learning Chinese is something that requires you to remember a lot of things. So let's take a look at how spaced repetition software helps us with the memory game. So first of all, as I mentioned before, there's been over 100 years of research on how often does somebody need to see a fact, and at what frequency do they need to see the fact before it enters their long-term memory. The result of this research has been 90 to 95% retention rate of the facts learned in the first place. This is an incredibly high percentage, but it is important to recognize that it is not 100%. If you're expecting perfection throughout this process of learning Mandarin, then you're going to be waiting a long time, because nobody is perfect. I don't speak English perfectly. You don't speak your native language perfectly. It's not something that you can just assume will be perfect, but at least we could get it to 90 to 95% retention, which is really quite extraordinary. So this is a graph from the website supermemo.com. I would highly recommend you go check it out. And what this graph is showing is that if you learn a new fact at that 100% point, over time, you'll forget it. And so when it is about a 90% likelihood that you're going to remember a fact, a spaced repetition software will reveal the fact to you again and say, hey, you have a 90% likelihood of remembering this particular fact right now. So now's the time to take a look at it again. But if you think about it, every time that you see a new fact, every time a new fact enters your mind space, then that fact is solidified slightly, which means that your forgetting curve, as you can see on the graph there, will become shallower. It will take you longer to get to the point of 90% likelihood of remembering. If you get reminded again and you get it right again, further solidification of that particular fact. So you can take a now longer period of time before it's necessary to see the fact again. Now, at the beginning of the research on how long it takes for somebody to get to this 90% likelihood point, there was lots of papers being moved from bins and people manually moving it from file folder to file folder so as to remember when to next remind a person of the fact. Luckily today, softwares can easily take care of all of this. It's like your reviewing secretary. Now, we may not have talked about this before yet in the video series. However, every night when you go to sleep, your brain filters out what it considers to be the useless information of the day, as it should. I mean, you don't need to remember the can of tuna you opened, the conversation you had with the dry cleaner. You don't need to remember this stuff. It's not essential to your future survival. So your brain filters it out. However, when it comes to learning language, it's very easy for our brains to go, oh, that's just that language that I don't know. I can hear the people over there speaking that Chinese language that my brain has already figured out. I don't understand, so just ignore it, filter it out. However, when you use spaced repetition software, you're essentially signaling to your brain, hey, pay attention to this. This is important stuff. Here's another way you could conceptualize this. As I mentioned before, when you learn a new fact, there's going to be a period of time soon afterwards where you have a 90% likelihood of remembering that fact. Now, spaced repetition software reminds you at that point, you're solidified, and then you have a longer period of time before you get to that 90% threshold. But sometimes that 10% likelihood of not getting it correct is going to happen 1 in 10 times. So every time that happens, essentially the metadata on the particular fact gets reset to the beginning. So even that 90 to 95% retention rate, that's the likelihood that you'll never forget it after learning it one time and being reminded of it every so often with a ever increasing interval. However, if you do get it wrong, you just reset it, and then you'll probably get it right. Maybe even sometimes you'll have to reset it a few times, but eventually it's going to go in. And that's the beautiful thing about spaced repetition software when it comes to memory.